This is Professor Fremstead again. Today I'm going to continue our analysis from Unit 5 and looking at how agents bargain over the surplus. So we left off looking at coercive allocations and contrasting those with voluntary allocations in this interaction between Angela and Bruno. If Bruno can coerce Angela to work however much he demands, then he's going to choose point B. He's going to maximize the vertical distance between the feasible frontier and her survival constraint. He's going to choose allocation B, where Angela gets 13 hours of free time and works 11-hour days, where she produces 10 bushels, where Bruno gets 6 of those bushels, and Angela gets 4 of the bushels, just enough for her to survive. Now, when Angela can refuse Bruno's offer, things change because all of a sudden, she's not going to accept this sort of allocation like B because they're below her reservation indifference curve. So if Angela can refuse Bruno's offer, Bruno has to offer her something that's at least as good as a reservation option, which here we're assuming she could get 2.5 bushels, not working at all, perhaps living in the poorhouse. If Angela can refuse Bruno's offer, then Bruno's going to maximize the vertical distance between the feasible frontier and a reservation indifference curve. He's going to offer her allocation D, which Angela would just barely accept, right? You might wonder, why is she going to accept point D if it makes her no better off than Z? And so you can think of it sometimes as him offering her something just slightly better, maybe instead of 4.5 bushels, 4.6, but offering her something a little bit better than Z that she does then barely accept. Angela will then work 8 hours, have 16 hours of leisure, and get 4.5 bushels of the 9 that she produces. So that 4.5 go to Angela, the other 4.5 go to Bruno. So clearly, as we move from the coercive allocation B to the voluntary allocation D, things get better off for Angela, right? She gets an extra 3 hours of leisure and an extra half bushel of grain. The freedom to say no really does improve her outcome, right? While this might seem very abstract, right? While this might seem very abstract, it's related to real historical experience, right? Until 1865, American plantation owners extracted economic rents through violent coercion, right? After 1865, right, plantation owners extracted smaller economic rents through mostly voluntary agreements with former slaves, right? But going from slavery to freedom, even if it was just one kind of freedom, a freedom in which, right, sharecroppers did not own the land and still had to provide the owners of the land with a big share of the surplus, still going from slavery to freedom did improve lives of black workers in the United States, both by increasing, right, their incomes and also increasing the amount of free time that they had. Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery in 1838 and became a prominent abolitionist and social reformer, noted sort of the relationship between slavery and the one kind of freedom that you get in a labor market, right? In fact, by 1886, he was criticizing free labor, wage labor, as not that much better than slavery, but noting that it was definitely better, right? He wrote in 1886, "What labor everywhere wants, what it ought to have and will someday demand and receive is an honest day's pay for an honest day's work. As the laborer becomes more intelligent, he will develop what capital he already possesses, that is the power to organize and combine for its own protection. Experience demonstrates that there may be a wages of slavery only a little less galling and crushing in its effects than chattel slavery, and that this slavery of wages must go down with the other." Right? Frederick Douglass here is noting that free labor, wage labor, is better than slavery, but it's not necessarily a lot better, right? It's still possible for the powerful landowners and so on to extract a large share of the surplus. And in fact, a lot of the injustice in this country goes back to the way that we emancipated slaves in the United States. In 1865, General Sherman issued an order to provide ex-slave families with up to 40 acres and a mule, right? Recognizing that liberated slaves were not going to be able to live free lives without access to the means of production for themselves. That would have allowed Black Americans to work as independent farmers instead of as sharecroppers for their old slave masters. But these lands were ultimately restored to former slave owners, leaving ex-slaves landless. And while 40 acres and a mule might not seem a lot to you, right? In 2020, 40 acres and a mule is not worth a tremendous amount, right? But in 1865, if you took that and invested it, it would have been worth hundreds of thousands of dollars today, right? In fact, the fact that liberated slaves did not receive any wealth with the liberation explains a big part of the difference in wealth owned by white and black families, right? In the United States, the median black family, right, has a wealth of only $11,000 compared to $134,000 for the median white family. 40 acres and a mule 150 years ago would make up that difference, right? Note here also the extreme inequality in the distribution of wealth, right? Not only between races, but also within race, right? So if you look at the average wealth per family, it's much, much higher. For a white family, it's $680,000 almost. That is taking into account all of the wealth owned by white families divided by the total number of white families. So it includes like Jeff Bezos, $170 billion, gets included in average wealth in a way it doesn't get included in median wealth, right? So of course, there's a huge amount of wealth inequality within each race. There's also a lot of wealth inequality between. When Angela is an independent farmer, remember, she actually chooses to work 8-hour days and just gets the full 9 bushels for herself, because we assumed her preferences in this unit are quasi-linear. When Angela is free but landless farmer, she'll accept any allocation, right, at D or above, right, assuming that there are many landless farmers and that she's been given essentially a take it or leave it offer. Every point between C and D is Pareto efficient. And that's because in all of those, Angela works 8 hours, which maximizes a surplus of 4.5 bushels. Right? It's important to note she produces 9 bushels of grain, but she needs 4.5 of those to be willing to do the job. So there's a 4.5 bushel surplus. Since the surplus is maximized anywhere between C and D, it's impossible to make Angela better off without harming Bruno and vice versa. CD we call the Pareto efficiency curve. It joins all the economically feasible points where the marginal rate of substitution, the slope of the indifference curves, of Angela's indifference curves, equals the slope of the marginal rate of transformation. At allocation G, for example, Angela would receive a rent of 1.5 bushels, and Bruno would receive a rent of 3 bushels, right? Angela would get 1.5 of the bushels of surplus, and 3 of them would go to Bruno. So the question is, how could Angela get from a point like D to maybe a point like G, a point where she gets surplus as well as Bruno getting surplus? Well, one way would be to organize with other farmers, to strike, which is of course what workers have done historically in capitalism. This is an image of the famous Bread and Roses strike, right, in which textile workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts demanded not just enough money to pay for their bread, but enough money for the finer things in life as well. And here's an image of Unite Here strike in Chicago a couple years ago, again with workers demanding their share of the profits, right, from the big hotel chains that they work for. Imagine that Angela and her fellow striking farmers win a new allocation of 4.5 bushels in exchange for a 4-hour workday. Right? Essentially, what they would win then is a new allocation F. What they win is the opportunity of 20 hours of free time in exchange for 4.5 bushels, right, mandated by the government. Angela now is clearly on a higher indifference curve. Right? She's on indifference curve 2. And she's now receiving a rent of 1.5 bushels. Right? In fact, this new indifference curve 2 is always 1.5 higher than where we were on our original indifference curve. Right? No matter where you go, right or left, the gap here is the same. It might look to you like it gets closer and closer as you move this way, but the vertical distance actually does not get closer and closer. Bruno's rent then falls from 4.5 bushels, which is what he got when you were at point D, right, to a mere 2 bushels, which is the vertical distance between E and F. However, point F is inefficient. That allocation is inefficient because the marginal rate of substitution is less than the marginal rate of transformation. You can see the slope of Angela's indifference curve is less than the slope of her feasible frontier, which means if she worked one more hour, she would produce more grain than you would need to pay her for her to be willing to take that job. Right? And we know that point F is not on the Pareto efficiency curve from C to D. That means that the surplus is not maximized. Right? It's 3.5 bushels instead of 4.5 bushels. Right? From E to this point down here, there's now 3.5 bushels are splitting up rather than 4.5. Allocation F is Pareto inefficient. The fact that it's inefficient means that both people could be better off if Angela works more hours, since the extra grain she would produce in an additional hour exceeds what you would have to pay her for her to be willing to do it. Remember that on the Pareto efficiency curve, Angela gets exactly 16 hours of leisure, and the total surplus is 4.5 bushels, split somehow between Angela and Bruno. Initially, when he makes a take it or leave it offer, Bruno gets all the surplus at point D, but some other points up here would be better for both of them than where they are now. Right? Angela would need at least 1.5 of those bushels to be better off than she is at point F, right? To be on the Pareto efficiency curve above indifference curve 2. Meanwhile, Bruno would need at least 2 of those bushels to be better off than he is at point F. So at point F, right, remember Angela's getting 1.5 bushels. You see that here. Bruno's getting 2 bushels. You see that here. Right? If we move back to the Pareto efficiency curve, we can make them both better off if we go somewhere between G, where Angela's no worse off than she is at F, and H, where Bruno's no worse off than he is at F. Both Bruno and Angela would prefer an allocation between G and H. Right? They might agree to allocation J, right? Where Angela gets 16 hours of leisure. She produces, like before, 9 bushels of grain, but she now gets to keep 6.5 of those bushels, and Bruno gets to keep the other 2.5 of those bushels. Right? That would be a situation make them both better than F. The key insight here is whenever you have an inefficient allocation, it's possible to move to an efficient allocation and share the extra surplus in a way that makes some people better off without making anyone worse off. Which allocation is efficient? Well, we know that E and F are inefficient allocations, right? Anywhere over here where she's working only 4 hours a day, she would produce a lot more working 1 extra hour than you would have to pay her for her to be willing to do it. However, D and G and H and C are all efficient allocations, J2. So the question really is, among these efficient allocations, which allocation is the most fair? And that's something that you need to go back and imagine that you were playing this game or you're in the social interaction, but you didn't know whether or not you were going to be Angela or Bruno. Behind that veil of ignorance, think, right, about how much of the surplus you think should go to the worker and how much of the surplus you think should go to the landlord. In summary, right, there are gains from trade whenever people have different preferences or different skills or different property. Right? That's why we trade things with one another. How the surplus is divided from those gains of trade, right? Gains from trade are surplus. How that surplus is divided depends on biology, it depends on technology, but it crucially depends on institutions. Right? If we look over time, right, we see that sometimes institutions have led to very unequal outcomes in the economy. Sometimes they've led to more equal outcomes. This figure from Unit 2, right, we looked at labor productivity and the median wage, right? And what we see is that from 1760 to 1930 or so, labor productivity grew fairly consistently, right? But real wages actually did not go up until after some important laws were passed, such as the 10 Hours Act, that limited work for women and children in the UK. Finally, wages started to come up, but between 1760 and 1860, although people had gotten much more productive, right, essentially all that increase in production, all that increase in surplus went to the owners of capital rather than to workers. Remember, these are the real wages of London craftsmen. We actually have a very similar figure for the United States over the last few decades. Right? Starting in 1950 or 1948, if you look at both labor productivity, right, which is simply GDP divided by the number of total hours worked in the economy, right, you see labor productivity increased in step with hourly compensation for the median worker between 1848 and about 1973, right? Every year you get a certain amount more productive and the same amount increase in pay. But after the 70s, right, or after 1973, although productivity continued to increase at about the same rate, hourly compensation has not increased much at all. And so that today, workers, the median worker in the United States earns only 9% more than they earned back in 1970, despite the fact that they're 138% more productive than they were then. Right? The question is sort of why hasn't technological progress increased wages for US workers for about 40 years? Another way of looking at the same thing, right, is to turn to the radicals at McKinsey and Company and look at labor's share of output. Right? At the beginning of the example of Angela and Bruno, right, the first voluntary take it or leave it offer that Angela accepts, they're splitting output 50-50. Well, in the actual US economy, it's not quite that unequal, but it's close. Labor was in the 1950s getting about 2/3 of output, 65%, right? But that's fallen pretty steadily, especially since about the year 2000, where now workers' wages make up about 57% of GDP, right, with the rest going to capital. So when labor's share of output declines, of course, it means capital's share of output grows, and that helps explain the fact that wages have stagnated. That's related to the fact that some capitalists are phenomenally wealthy in 2020. Institutions affect the income distribution. So if you consider proposals for, say, a $15 minimum wage, or Medicare for all, or universal child care, or Green New Deal, or a wealth tax on the richest 0.1% of the population, all those policies would change the income distribution. Right? A thing to think about is, would these policies redistribute income from owners to workers? Is that sort of fair, if you think that's the effect? Right? And there, it sort of depends on what you believe is fair. How much income should go to workers and how much income should go to owners. Right? But another way to think about these policies is, would they increase or decrease the surplus? And maybe at a very simple level, increase or decrease GDP. Right? Surplus is not quite the same as GDP, right? If it changes, say, the number of hours that people work. But if you think that some of these policies could actually make our country wealthier, not just redistribute from the rich to the poor, those are actually efficiency arguments for things like universal child care. Right? By providing universal child care, you may liberate mostly women, but parents, from looking after children and being able to work in other sectors of the economy. If you think, right, that universal child care would increase GDP, you might think it's actually a surplus expanding sort of policy.